Okay, a question that I get from a ton of you is, where do I start if I want to start a podcast? And I love when answers are simpler than we expect them to be. So I want to tell you about a resource that's changed the game for us with our podcast, and that is Spotify for podcasters. If you want to start your own podcast, Spotify has a platform that makes it so easy. You upload your episodes and then Spotify actually distributes it everywhere onto all platforms and even helps you earn money so that it can be profitable for you and a blessing for you, your family, your people. Spotify for Podcasters lets you record and edit your podcast literally from your phone or your computer. So if you don't have a fancy setup, it's okay. You can immediately get started today. Then again, you distribute it to Spotify and everywhere else that podcasts are available. You can also do video podcasts, which sounds like a dream to me. And when you want to take conversations with your people to the next level, you can do Q&A and polls, all sorts of fun things. You can earn money with ads and podcast subscriptions, or you can just get started using what you've got for the good of others and the glory of God. Check out Spotify for Podcasters. I use it. I love it. I highly recommend it. Download the Spotify for Podcasters app. I have it on my phone, highly suggest, or go to spotify.com/podcasters to get started today.
Welcome to the Go and Tell Gals podcast. I'm your host, Jess Connolly. I'm an author, a Bible teacher, a coach, and I'm obsessed with helping women take their place in the kingdom and use their God-given gifts. At Go and Tell Gals, we equip and encourage women with different tools like our Map to More guide, our group coaching program, Go Teams, and even by training other women as coaches through our licensing program. Whether you're a college student, a stay-at-home mom, a small business owner, an astronaut, or a veterinarian, our goal is that you leave this episode feeling more empowered to do what God has called you to do. We're so glad you're here and we're on your team. Let's jump into this week's episode. Hey gals, you are listening to the Go and Tell Gals podcast. This is Jess, and this is one of our Monday morning mini coaching sessions. Here's the deal. Your weakness is not a liability. Your weakness is not a liability. You guys, I have this one horrible memory that unfortunately lives rent-free in my mind. It was in my early 20s, and honestly, my husband and I were going through a horrific time. We were struggling financially. We were trying really hard to get back on our feet, but we were just struggling, and we were also pregnant with our first child, and we just really weren't sure which way was up. The world was turning really fast. Everything was changing really fast, and we were having a hard time regrouping. And it was made a little bit more difficult in that a lot of people around us seemed to have life figured out. They either had really steady jobs, or they were really established in their careers, or they already had a bunch of kids and felt like really competent parents. And so we were just kind of flailing and finding our way and struggling. And in the middle of that season, we happened to go to a small group, a married couples small group. And that night, we were kind of sharing prayer requests and talking about how we were doing. And if I can be honest, I just broke down. I just started sobbing and crying. And I remember just telling everybody at the group, I'm really not sure how we're going to keep going. I don't really know which way is up. We're having a hard time. We're just really struggling. And they comforted us and prayed for us. And I'll never forget, though, this is so painful and so hurtful. And I'm so glad that I haven't seen anything like this happen for a long time. But someone actually called my husband the next day and said, listen, we just want to talk to you about Jess and the crying. And they were like, she just seems, pretty emotional and pretty broken. And we understand it's a hard situation, but it kind of like took over group last night, and that's a lot. And maybe if she could just kind of keep that in. And while that story is unfortunately true and so damaging and a really bad example of how Christians often overtly encourage one another to hide their weaknesses. The truth is, we're not just overtly told to hide our weaknesses, we're really subtly told to hide our weaknesses. We are rewarded sometimes for acting like we don't have any. And the problem is that the power of God is made perfect in our weaknesses. And so when we pretend as if we don't have any, we miss out on a lot of God's power. 2 Corinthians 12:9 says, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Paul goes on to say, "Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me." What scripture tells us is that God is not surprised by your weaknesses. He is not taken back about them. He's not dismayed about them. Instead, he is actually going to use them to display his infinite and good grace in your life. So I have a couple questions before we even really let ourselves live under this banner of weaknesses not being a liability. And the first question is this: what you're dealing with right now, is it actually a weakness? Is it a kingdom weakness, or is it a cultural weakness? Let me give you some clarification here. A kingdom weakness would be something that is really keeping you from intimacy with God or other people. It may be a hardship that's happening in your life. It could be a genuine flaw that you need to work through. But a cultural weakness is something that maybe God has not said is bad at all. And instead, culture, everyone around you just says, this is no good. This is bad. I would say an example would be when we call little girls bossy. And in fact, they're actually just good leaders. I would say leadership is a kingdom strength, but it's often seen as a cultural weakness. So you first have to ask the question about your own weaknesses that you may feel tempted to hide or pretend as if they don't exist. Is it cultural or is it kingdom? The next question that I think we really have to ask ourselves is, what is God building in me through this particular weakness? If it's a hardship, if it's a struggle, if it's an area of your life where you're needing to confess and grow, what is God building in you? What is God growing in you? Sometimes we don't always know. Sometimes we can't claim it. But I do believe that we have the authority in our own lives to say, God would not have allowed this weakness, this pain, this hardship, if he was not going to use it for good. What is God building in you, through you, because of this weakness? Lastly, I think one thing we have to really consider in light of weaknesses, and this would be hard days or even just hard parts of our personality, is there a bigger picture that we need to trust in? And I say this so carefully and so cautiously because I know so many people have been hurt by Christian language that says like, oh, everything happens for a reason, no big deal. And I actually think that would be an example of hiding a weakness, of trying to pull the rug over it. But I'm advocating for something a little bit different. I'm advocating for an honesty that says this part of my life or this part of my personality or this part of this thing that I'm struggling with is actually really painful. But in the midst of acknowledging its pain or its actual negativity, I am going to hope that God is going to use it or is using it as a part of some bigger picture. I'm not pretending like it's not real. I'm not pretending like it doesn't affect me, but I am hoping that eternally there's a perspective here that I cannot see. Your weaknesses are not a liability. Owning your own weaknesses, the things that you're struggling with that may be impacting other people, honestly takes power away from the enemy of your soul and gives it back to God. Confessing your weaknesses, maybe the areas where you genuinely feel strength or where you know you really need growth, brings the refreshment that many of us are desperate for. And when you refuse to apologize for kingdom strengths that may be seen as cultural weaknesses, you help yourself and every single woman around you glorify and magnify God, not just through their strength, but also through what's hard in their own lives. Wherever you feel weak right now, this week, I want to remind you that God is not surprised and he is not taken aback. He is not asking you to spend all of your energy pretending as if your problems are not real. He is not asking you to hide every single area where you don't feel all that strong. Instead, he wants to come alongside you to give you his strength, to show you his grace so that you can see his power rest on your life. Your weaknesses are not a liability. In Jesus' name. You are listening to the Go and Tell Gals podcast. You can find us at goandtellgals.com online or Go and Tell Gals on Instagram or Facebook. We would be so honored if you had a minute to leave a review wherever you've listened to this episode. Share it with your friends and let us know that you're listening. We're so grateful for you. God is mighty in you.